Sir, people like you do not belong in this area. The sentence cut through the crowded airport terminal louder than the boarding announcements overhead. Travelers slowed their pace. A few turned their heads. Others pretended not to notice. But everyone within earshot heard it. Darius Mitchell stopped walking and looked up calmly. He was standing near a priority security entrance inside one of the busiest airports in the country. Around him, rolling suitcases rattled across polished floors. Flight information boards flashed constantly above the crowds. Families hurried toward departure gates while business travelers checked their watches. Yet for a brief moment, it felt as though the entire terminal had gone still. The man who had spoken was Gregory Walker, a senior airport operations manager with nearly 3 decades of experience. His navy blazer was neatly pressed. His identification badge hung prominently from his chest. His expression carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Gregory looked Darius up and down before speaking again. This lane is reserved for authorized passengers. Darius glanced toward the sign overhead. He knew exactly where he was. I understand, he replied calmly. I was directed here. Gregory folded his arms. By who? Darius answered politely, but Gregory barely seemed interested in listening. Several nearby travelers began watching more openly now. Darius stood out from the crowd, not because he was loud or demanding, but because he remained completely composed. He wore a simple dark jacket, tailored slacks, and carried a modest travel bag. Nothing about his appearance suggested wealth. Nothing advertised the fact that he was one of the most respected technology leaders in the aviation industry. Gregory took another step forward. Sir, I am going to need you to move to the standard line. His tone suggested the conversation was already over. Darius could feel the eyes of strangers on him. It was not a new feeling. Success had introduced him to boardrooms, investors, and world leaders. Yet moments like this reminded him of something he had learned long ago. Some people made decisions about others before learning a single fact. A young airport employee working nearby looked uncomfortable. She seemed ready to say something but hesitated. Gregory continued. The rules exist for a reason. Darius nodded. I agree. The answer caught Gregory off guard. He had expected resistance. Instead, he found calm confidence. Then you understand why you cannot stay here, Gregory said. Around them, the tension continued building. A few travelers exchanged glances. One businessman quietly stepped aside to watch. Another passenger slowed her pace completely. Darius remained relaxed. His posture never changed. His voice never rose. Gregory interpreted the silence as compliance. What he did not realize was that the man standing in front of him had spent years mastering the art of patience. Darius knew exactly who he was. He did not need strangers to confirm it. He also knew something else. In less than an hour, many of the people inside this airport would learn his name. But that was not what occupied his thoughts. As Gregory continued speaking, Darius found himself wondering something entirely different. If this man was willing to judge a complete stranger so quickly, how many others had experienced the same thing before today? Gregory Walker expected the conversation to end the moment he pointed toward the standard security line. Most people either argued or immediately complied. Darius Mitchell did neither. He simply stood there with a calm expression that seemed almost out of place amid the growing tension. The airport manager found that strangely irritating. Around them, the terminal continued moving at its usual pace, but the small crowd that had gathered remained interested. People sensed that something unusual was happening. Darius adjusted the strap of his travel bag and glanced briefly toward the massive windows overlooking the runways. Aircraft taxied beneath a clear afternoon sky. Travelers began boarding flights that would carry them across the country and around the world. Life continued normally for everyone else. For Darius, however, the moment felt familiar. Not because he had experienced this exact situation before, but because he recognized the mindset behind it. Gregory looked at him again. Are you planning to move? He asked. His tone was polite on the surface, but the impatience underneath was becoming obvious. Darius offered a small smile. If that is what you want me to do. The answer only seemed to frustrate Gregory further. He had expected resistance. He had expected a debate. Instead, he found someone completely unwilling to be pulled into conflict. A nearby traveler whispered something to her husband. Another passenger quietly lifted a phone, pretending to check messages while watching the exchange. Darius noticed none of it. Or perhaps he noticed all of it and simply chose not to react. Years of leadership had taught him that people revealed more about themselves when they believed they were in control. Gregory straightened his blazer. Some individuals think rules are optional, he said loudly enough for others to hear. That creates problems for everyone. The comment hung in the air. Darius knew it was not really about airport procedures anymore. It was about assumptions. The same assumptions that quietly shaped countless interactions every day. Before he could answer, a young employee approached cautiously from a nearby information desk. Her name tag identified her as Olivia Brooks. She looked between Gregory and Darius with growing concern. Something about the man standing in front of her seemed familiar. She had seen interviews, industry conferences, magazine covers. The realization was beginning to form, but she was not entirely certain yet. Gregory noticed her hesitation. Everything is fine here, he said quickly. Olivia nodded but did not leave immediately. Darius met her eyes for a brief moment. She seemed thoughtful, almost puzzled. Then she returned to her station. Gregory appeared satisfied. He interpreted her silence as agreement. Darius interpreted it differently. As the crowd slowly began moving again, Gregory checked his watch. I have work to do, he said. Please use the standard line. Darius nodded once. Of course. He turned and started walking without another word. Gregory watched him leave, convinced he had resolved the situation. What he did not know was that within the next hour, he would walk into a meeting that could change the future of the entire airport. And sitting at the center of that meeting would be the very man he had just dismissed without ever bothering to learn his name. Gregory Walker spent the next hour convinced he had handled the situation correctly. As far as he was concerned, he had enforced airport procedures and moved on with his day. Yet something about the encounter continued bothering him. He could not explain why. Perhaps it was the way Darius Mitchell had remained calm. Perhaps it was the complete absence of anger. Most people who felt insulted reacted immediately. They argued. They demanded supervisors. They raised their voices. Darius had done none of those things. Instead, he had walked away with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. Meanwhile, several floors above the terminal, airport executives were gathering inside a conference room overlooking the runways. Financial reports covered the table. Operational reviews filled presentation screens. The airport was facing one of the most important strategic decisions in years. Passenger satisfaction had declined. Technology systems were aging. Several major airlines had begun expressing concerns about efficiency and customer experience. The board wanted solutions, and they wanted them quickly. Across the airport, Darius entered a private executive lounge reserved for invited guests. A receptionist immediately recognized him and welcomed him inside. Unlike the crowded terminal below, the atmosphere here was calm and professional. Large windows stretched from floor to ceiling. Aircraft moved across the tarmac beneath bright afternoon sunlight. Darius accepted a cup of coffee and reviewed documents on a digital tablet. His schedule for the day was extensive. Meetings. Evaluations. Recommendations. Decisions that could influence thousands of employees and millions of travelers. Yet his thoughts kept returning to the interaction downstairs. Not because he felt personally offended. He had experienced prejudice before. Success did not magically erase it. What concerned him was something larger. If a senior manager felt comfortable making assumptions about one traveler, how often did similar moments happen throughout the airport? The question lingered in his mind. Back on the operations floor, Gregory attended a management briefing. Several supervisors discussed upcoming changes. Rumors had been circulating for weeks. A major consulting firm had been hired. New leadership recommendations were expected. Some departments might be reorganized. Gregory listened carefully, feeling a growing sense of unease. For the first time in years, he found himself uncertain about the future. He had dedicated nearly 30 years to the airport. It had become part of his identity. The possibility of significant changes made him uncomfortable. As the meeting ended, Olivia Brooks approached him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Gregory nodded. "What is it?" Olivia hesitated. "The gentleman from earlier. Did you happen to get his name?" Gregory frowned. "No." "Why would that matter?" Olivia looked toward the conference level visible through the glass elevators. "Just curious," she said quietly. Gregory dismissed the question and walked away. He never noticed the concern on her face. Olivia was becoming increasingly certain she knew exactly who that traveler was. And if she was right, the entire airport was only a few hours away from discovering that the quiet man everyone underestimated had arrived for a reason far bigger than anyone imagined. The executive conference room occupied the top floor of the airport administration building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the runways, where aircraft moved in carefully coordinated patterns beneath the afternoon sun. Inside, however, the atmosphere felt far less orderly. Airport executives, department heads, financial analysts, and operations managers filled the room. Reports were stacked across the long conference table. Large presentation screens displayed charts, performance metrics, customer satisfaction trends, and operational forecasts. Everyone understood the importance of the meeting. The airport stood at a crossroads. Decisions made that day could shape its future for years. Gregory Walker entered carrying a folder filled with operational reports. He greeted several colleagues before taking his seat. The uncertainty he had been feeling all morning had not disappeared. Rumors about restructuring continued circulating through every department. New recommendations were expected. New priorities. New leadership expectations. Gregory glanced toward the empty chair positioned near the center of the table. It was reserved for the lead consultant, the individual responsible for evaluating the airport's future. Around the room, quiet conversations continued until the board chairman entered. The room gradually settled. Then the doors opened once more. Darius Mitchell walked inside. Several executives immediately stood. A few crossed the room to shake his hand. Others greeted him with obvious respect. Gregory watched the reactions with mild curiosity. He recognized none of the significance behind them. To him, Darius was simply another outside consultant. Nothing more. Darius acknowledged the greetings politely before taking his seat near the center of the table. His calm demeanor never changed. He reviewed a few notes, exchanged brief comments with senior leadership, and listened as the meeting officially began. For the next hour, department leaders presented reports. Financial performance. Passenger satisfaction. Staffing concerns. Technology limitations. Operational inefficiencies. The problems were substantial. Some executives defended existing procedures. Others argued for immediate change. Throughout it all, Darius listened far more than he spoke. He seemed interested not only in the numbers but also in the people presenting them. Gregory eventually stood to deliver his own report. He spoke confidently about airport operations, employee compliance, and procedural enforcement. Years of experience gave authority to his words. Several people nodded as he spoke. Darius listened carefully. Then Gregory made a statement that caught his attention. Most operational issues can be prevented when staff trust their instincts, Gregory said. Experienced employees learn to identify situations quickly. Good judgment matters. The comment seemed harmless to most people in the room. Darius remained silent for a moment before speaking. And how often are those judgments wrong? The question was delivered calmly. Gregory looked toward him. Not often. Darius folded his hands. How would you measure that? The room grew slightly quieter. Gregory hesitated. It was not a difficult question, yet something about the way it was asked made him uncomfortable. Darius continued studying the reports on the table. His expression revealed nothing. But for the first time that day, Gregory found himself wondering whether the quiet traveler from earlier had been paying far closer attention than anyone realized. Across the room, Olivia Brooks sat perfectly still. She knew exactly who Darius Mitchell was now. And as the discussion continued, she began to realize that the airport was moving steadily toward a moment that would leave many people speechless. As the meeting continued, the discussion shifted away from statistics and toward people. Department budgets, technology upgrades, and operational forecasts mattered, but everyone in the room understood that leadership decisions would ultimately determine whether the airport improved or continued struggling. Gregory Walker returned to his seat after presenting his report, yet his confidence had begun to fade. Darius Mitchell's questions lingered in his mind. They were simple questions. Reasonable questions. Yet they had exposed something Gregory could not easily explain. For years, he had trusted his instincts. He had built an entire career around them. Now, for the first time, someone was forcing him to examine them more closely. Across the table, Darius quietly reviewed additional documents provided by the board. Hidden among the financial reports was information that most employees had never seen. Several departments were scheduled for restructuring. Leadership positions would be re-evaluated. New standards would be implemented throughout the airport. The changes were not designed to punish people. They were designed to prepare the airport for the future. Still, Darius immediately noticed one name appearing repeatedly throughout the internal reviews. Gregory Walker. Performance evaluations described him as experienced, dedicated, and dependable. Yet they also highlighted concerns. Resistance to change. Communication issues. Growing numbers of passenger complaints connected to interactions involving his department. None of the concerns alone were severe. Together, however, they painted a troubling picture. During a short break, executives left the room to answer calls and gather additional materials. Darius remained near the window overlooking the runways. Aircraft moved steadily beneath the afternoon sunlight. Olivia Brooks approached cautiously. Mr. Mitchell, she said quietly. Darius turned and smiled. Olivia. She seemed surprised he remembered her name. I wanted to apologize for earlier. Darius shook his head. There is nothing for you to apologize for. Olivia hesitated before speaking again. Gregory is not a bad person. The statement caught Darius's attention. You sound concerned. Olivia glanced toward the hallway. Everyone is talking about possible changes. If leadership gets reorganized, he is probably one of the people most at risk. Darius listened carefully. Why? Olivia lowered her voice. His wife has been dealing with health problems. He has been under a lot of pressure for months. Most people do not know it, but he has been struggling. Darius remained silent. The information added a layer he had not expected. It did not excuse poor judgment. It did not justify assumptions. But it reminded him of something important. Every person carried burdens invisible to everyone else. A few minutes later, the meeting resumed. Gregory returned to his seat looking tired. For the first time all day, Darius noticed details he had previously overlooked. The strain around his eyes. The exhaustion in his posture. The subtle signs of someone carrying far more than workplace stress. The realization changed nothing about what had happened earlier. Yet it changed how Darius viewed the man sitting across from him. Around the room, executives prepared for the final presentation of the afternoon. What Gregory did not know was that the next hour would reveal the truth about Darius Mitchell. And what Darius did not yet know was that when that moment arrived, he would be forced to make a decision far more important than proving someone wrong. The board chairman stood and dimmed the lights. Conversations faded immediately. Every executive in the room turned their attention toward the presentation screen at the front of the conference room. The final session of the day had arrived. For months, airport leadership had waited for recommendations from the consulting team responsible for evaluating the future of the organization. Now those recommendations were about to be revealed. Gregory Walker adjusted his chair and folded his hands on the table. A feeling of unease had settled in his stomach. He could not explain it. The room felt different. More focused. More serious. Darius Mitchell remained calm as he rose from his seat and walked toward the screen. The confidence in his movements immediately commanded attention. Several executives exchanged knowing glances. Others sat forward with anticipation. Gregory noticed the reactions but still failed to understand their significance. Darius connected a tablet to the presentation system. Within seconds, the screen illuminated with charts, operational data, passenger satisfaction trends, and financial projections. The analysis was thorough, detailed, precise. For nearly 20 minutes, Darius walked the room through opportunities for improvement. Technology modernization. Employee development. Leadership accountability. Passenger experience enhancements. Every recommendation was supported by data. Every conclusion was difficult to dispute. The room listened carefully. Then the presentation reached its final section. The screen changed. The airport logo disappeared. A new image appeared instead. It was a photograph of Darius Mitchell standing in front of a state-of-the-art aviation technology center. Beneath the image appeared a list of accomplishments. Founder and Chief Executive Officer of AeroVision Systems. Strategic Advisor to Major Transportation Networks. Recipient of multiple National Innovation Awards. Leader of one of the most influential aviation technology companies in the country. Silence filled the room. Gregory stared at the screen. Then he looked toward Darius. Then back at the screen again. For the first time all day, genuine confusion crossed his face. The board chairman smiled slightly. For anyone who may not be familiar, he said, Mr. Mitchell's company currently supports operational systems used by airports across the United States. His recommendations have transformed transportation networks nationwide. Gregory felt his pulse quicken. The realization was beginning to form. Around him, executives nodded with obvious respect. Some had worked with Darius before. Others had spent months trying to secure his involvement in the project. Gregory's mind immediately returned to the terminal earlier that day. The security lane. The assumptions. The dismissive comments. Suddenly every detail felt painfully clear. Darius looked around the room before speaking again. His voice remained calm. Earlier today, I spent time observing airport operations firsthand. Gregory lowered his eyes. He already knew where this was going. What I found was encouraging in many areas, Darius continued. But I also observed moments where assumptions influenced decisions. The room grew completely silent. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. Darius glanced briefly toward Gregory, not with anger, not with triumph, but with honesty. Leadership is not measured by how we treat people who can help us, he said. It is measured by how we treat people when we believe they have nothing to offer. The words landed heavily across the conference table. Gregory felt as though the entire room had disappeared around him. For the first time in years, he was forced to confront a possibility he had spent his career avoiding. Perhaps his greatest professional weakness was not a lack of experience. Perhaps it was the belief that experience alone guaranteed good judgment. And as the truth settled over the room, Gregory became convinced that his career at the airport might be about to end. The meeting adjourned temporarily, but very few people left their seats. The atmosphere inside the conference room had changed completely. What began as a routine strategic review had become something far more personal. Gregory Walker remained seated, staring at the documents in front of him without actually reading them. The numbers had blurred together. The conversations around him sounded distant. For the first time in nearly 30 years at the airport, He felt genuinely uncertain about what would happen next. Several executives gathered near the windows discussing Darius Mitchell's recommendations. Others reviewed implementation plans and budget projections. The future of the airport suddenly seemed clearer than it had in years. Yet Gregory could focus on only one thing. Earlier that day, he had judged a stranger without knowing anything about him. Worse, he had done it confidently. The realization was difficult to escape. Across the room, Darius stood with members of the board, answering questions about leadership development programs and operational improvements. His demeanor remained exactly the same as it had been in the terminal. Calm. Professional. Unshaken. There was no sign of resentment. No sign of anger. That somehow made Gregory feel even worse. If Darius had confronted him publicly, it might have been easier to process. Instead, he had been forced to confront himself. Olivia Brooks noticed Gregory sitting alone and approached carefully. "Are you okay?" she asked. Gregory managed a tired smile. "I am not sure." Olivia pulled out a chair and sat beside him. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Finally Gregory looked toward the conference room entrance. "Did you know who he was?" Olivia nodded. "I suspected it." Gregory exhaled slowly. "I should have listened." The words sounded heavier than he intended. Olivia remained quiet. Gregory stared at the table. "I spent years believing experience gave me the ability to read people." He shook his head slightly. "Maybe I stopped paying attention." Across the room, Darius glanced in their direction briefly before returning to his discussion with the board chairman. Gregory noticed the glance and immediately looked away. His thoughts drifted toward home. Toward medical bills stacked on the kitchen counter. Toward sleepless nights spent worrying about his wife's health. Toward the rumors of restructuring that had circulated for months. Earlier that morning he had feared organizational changes. Now he feared something else entirely. He feared becoming an example of everything the airport needed to leave behind. As executives gradually returned to their seats, the board chairman called the room back to order. Final decisions would soon be discussed. New leadership initiatives would be announced. Gregory straightened in his chair and prepared himself for the worst. He assumed his career was over. He assumed Darius Mitchell would recommend his removal. Most people in the room quietly assumed the same thing. After all, power often created opportunities for revenge. But what nobody understood was that Darius had already made a decision. And the decision waiting just beyond the next discussion was not the one anyone expected. The board chairman returned to the front of the room and opened the final section of the meeting. Every executive settled into silence. Gregory Walker sat perfectly still, convinced he already knew what was coming. Years of experience had taught him to recognize difficult conversations before they happened. The expression on several faces around the table only reinforced his belief. He expected criticism. He expected consequences. He expected Darius Mitchell to recommend leadership changes that would end his career at the airport. After everything that had happened, it seemed inevitable. The chairman reviewed several recommendations involving technology modernization, employee development, and customer experience improvements. Each proposal received strong support from the board. Then he arrived at the section concerning leadership and organizational culture. Gregory felt his chest tighten. This was the moment he had been dreading. The chairman looked toward Darius. "Mr. Mitchell, would you like to address this portion personally?" Darius stood and walked slowly toward the front of the room. Through the conference room windows, aircraft continued moving across the airfield beneath the fading afternoon sun. Inside, nobody spoke. Everyone waited. Darius looked around the room before beginning. "This airport has talented people," he said. "It has dedicated employees. It has strong operational foundations. The challenge is not a lack of capability. The challenge is making sure experience continues to grow instead of becoming rigid." Several executives nodded. Gregory lowered his eyes. Darius continued. Today I observed examples of both strengths and weaknesses. I also observed something else. I observed people carrying pressures that most of their colleagues never see. Gregory slowly looked up. Darius's voice remained steady. Leadership is not about being perfect. It is about being willing to learn when you discover you were wrong. The room remained silent. Then the chairman turned to one specific page in the report. There is one recommendation that surprised several members of the board, he said. Gregory felt his stomach drop. Darius glanced toward him. I am not recommending the removal of Gregory Walker. The word seemed to freeze the room. Several executives exchanged shocked looks. Gregory stared in disbelief. For a moment he wondered whether he had heard correctly. Darius continued before anyone could speak. I am recommending that Gregory remain in his position and participate in a leadership development initiative that will help shape the future culture of this airport. The silence became even deeper. Gregory could not believe what he was hearing. Darius looked directly at him. People expect change to come from replacing individuals. Sometimes real change comes from helping people become better than they were yesterday. Gregory felt emotion rising in a way he had not experienced in years. Earlier that day, he had judged a stranger. Now that same man was protecting his future. Darius returned to his seat. Anyone can use power to punish, he said quietly. The harder choice is using it to build something better. Around the room, expressions shifted from surprise to understanding. The airport had expected a reckoning. Instead, it had witnessed something far more unexpected. And as Gregory sat there struggling to process what had happened, he realized that the lesson he would remember for the rest of his life had nothing to do with authority, position, or status. It had everything to do with grace. 1 year later, the airport looked different in ways that could not be measured by architecture or technology alone. Passenger satisfaction scores had reached their highest levels in more than a decade. Employee retention had improved. Customer complaints had declined significantly. New leadership programs were thriving. Travelers moving through the terminals every day rarely knew the story behind those changes, but they experienced the results. The culture had evolved. Respect had become a standard rather than an aspiration. On a bright spring morning, Darius Mitchell returned to the airport for a scheduled review of the initiatives his team had helped implement. As he walked through the terminal, he noticed small details that most people overlooked. Employees greeting passengers with genuine patience. Managers listening carefully before making decisions. Teams working together instead of operating in separate silos. The improvements were not perfect. No organization ever was. But the direction was unmistakable. Near an information desk, Olivia Brooks welcomed a group of newly hired employees. She had recently been promoted into a leadership role and now helped oversee customer experience programs throughout the airport. Her confidence had grown tremendously over the past year. When she noticed Darius approaching, she smiled. You picked a good day to visit, she said. Darius looked around the terminal. It seems that way. Olivia handed him a report. Best customer satisfaction numbers in 11 years. Darius reviewed the figures and nodded. That is excellent work. It took a lot of people, Olivia replied. But people are finally starting to understand that every interaction matters. Darius smiled. That lesson changes everything. Later that afternoon, he found himself standing near a large observation window overlooking the runways. Aircraft moved across the airfield beneath a sky filled with drifting white clouds. The scene reminded him of why he had entered the aviation industry in the first place. Transportation was about more than schedules and systems. It was about people. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Mitchell. Darius turned. Gregory Walker stood nearby. The difference between the man standing there now and the man from a year earlier was impossible to miss. The confidence remained, but it was balanced by humility. The certainty had been replaced by curiosity. Gregory extended his hand. Darius accepted it. I wanted to thank you, Gregory said. Again. Darius smiled slightly. You already did. Gregory nodded. I know. But some things deserve to be said more than once. For a moment both men looked out toward the runways. Gregory broke the silence first. You could have ended my career. Darius considered the statement. Maybe. Gregory shook his head. Most people would have. Darius watched an aircraft accelerate down the runway before lifting smoothly into the sky. Then most people would have missed an opportunity. Gregory looked at him. Darius continued. The goal was never proving you wrong. The goal was helping the airport become better. Gregory lowered his head briefly. I understand that now. They stood quietly for another moment as the aircraft disappeared into the distance. Eventually Gregory returned to work. Darius remained by the window. Looking back, he realized the most important victory had never been about status, power, or recognition. It had been about refusing to become the thing that had once hurt him. The airport had expected retaliation. Instead, it received transformation. And as another aircraft climbed into the open sky, Darius smiled, knowing that the strongest leaders are not remembered for the people they defeated. They are remembered for the people they helped rise.